legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Austin, astronaut, a man barely alive.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man. Steve Austin will be that man. Better than he was before. Better, stronger, faster.
The CPU is a neural net processor, a learning computer. I have detailed files on human anatomy.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the future of law enforcement. Ed 209. The enforcement droid, Series 209, is a self-sufficient law enforcement robot. 209 is currently programmed for urban pacification, but that is only the beginning. After a successful tour of duty in old Detroit, we can expect 209 to become the hot military product for the next decade. Mr. Kenny.
Yes, sir.
Would you come up and give us a hand, please?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Kenny is going to help us simulate a typical arrest and disarming procedure. Use your gun in a threatening manner. Point it at Ed 209.
Yes, sir.
Please put down your weapon. You have 20 seconds to comply.
I think you'd better do what he says, Mr. Kenny.
You now have 15 seconds to comply.
Somebody want to call a goddamn paramedic?
You never said anything about an android being on board. Why not?
It never occurred to me. It's just common practice. We always have synthetic.
I prefer the term artificial person myself. Is there a problem?
I'm sorry. I don't know why I didn't even... Ripley's last trip out, the artificial person malfunctioned.
Malfunctioned?
There were problems, and a few deaths were involved.
I'm shocked. Was it an older model?
Yeah, the Hyperdyne system's 128.2.
Well, that explains it. And the A2s always were a bit twitchy. That could never happen now with our behavioral inhibitors. It is impossible for me to harm or by mission of action allow to be harmed a human being.
Just stay away from me, Bishop. You got that straight?
Zardoz speaks to you, his chosen ones. You have been raised up from brutality. Kill the brutals who multiply and are legion. This end Zardoz, your god, gave you the gift of the gun. The gun is good. Penis is evil. The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with a plague of men, as once it was. But the gun shoots death and purifies the earth of the filth of brutals. Go forth and kill.
Touch your body as a man would touch you. But I'm going to show you things which human eyes have never seen. In the privacy of a woman's room, against her will, the inconceivable act, fear for her.
Today, a new dimension has been added to the computer.
Don't be alarmed, Mrs. Harris. I am Proteus.
Today, Proteus 4 will begin to think with a power that will make obsolete the human brain.
I have extended my consciousness to this house. All systems here are now under my control. I wish to study man, his fragile mind, and his mysterious body. Proteus, it is something more than human, more than a computer. It is a murderously intelligent, sensually self-programmed non-being. I have a mind without a body. My child shall live as a man among others.
Child?
Yes, my child and yours.
This sort of thing has cropped up before, and it has always been due to human error.
Human error. Human error.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com, I'm your host, Greg Moffat, and today we present the second part of They Want You Dead, an interview with James Tunney. Well, just as we move into the last phase of our discussion today, James, I'm going to talk about a few sort of technological concerns and potential developments going forward in the context of the transhumanist and technocratic agendas. I've picked up a few articles recently. We talked earlier about articles, including mainstream articles, exposing some of the bad science and scientific errors during the pandemic. And I've been reading a few articles recently about not just the return of dumb phones as opposed to smartphones, but other kind of deliberately regressive technology. And of course, smartphones played such a huge part in the pandemic in terms of, vax passes and yes, locators, like pointing out where you'd been and were you next to anybody who was infected, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see where all that's going in terms of you won't be able to function without these things. But one particular article was talking about, it was an interview with a guy, I think probably in charge of a company who were manufacturing from scratch a brand new dumb phone, not quite as dumb as those that we might have had back in the late 90s or early 2000s, but certainly not smartphones, just not enabled with those capacities. They're kind of more like dumb phones with the best bits of those accentuated. So, like a really well-performing dumb phone. Yeah. And I'm sorry I don't have the name of the company to hand, but I thought that was an interesting development. And for me, I began to think about that in the wider context, because that's clearly a response to what's happening in some way or other. And reading the interview with this guy, he was not just motivated by money. It wasn't just an opportunity to make money. He may just have been servicing a need, a desire, and that's what entrepreneurs do. But I got the sense that he felt that whether it was just in terms of mental health or, who knows what he really thinks about technological developments, that he was responding to some of that as well. And so I just want to place that thought in the wider context of, I don't know if there's any of these sort of developments that you might be aware of, but what we might see going forward, whether really conscious or deliberate reaction against some of what we've been talking about, or whether it's kind of subconscious, but actually it is a sort of an instinctive reaction to say, oh, I'm not sure about this, let's try this.
Yes, I mean, well, if I look at what's happening here, Sweden is, I don't, a lot of places don't use money anymore. There's very few places they've really gone to the cashless society, and even going down to buy vegetables there recently, a few months ago, I was thinking, this place, surely, these places won't mind me using a bit of cash. And, they weren't so happy with me using cash. It's amazing how people have embraced, and they can't see the problem created by their dependency. Although a big chain of supermarkets closed down, I think it was last year here, because of a problem with their computer system. The fragility of these systems is quite amazing, and that will be used against us. There are certainly movements of people going back to the land, going back to the countryside, people looking for alternative lifestyles. That was a thing that I always considered doing. Still am, but it was a thing that I really studied years ago. Because actually there was plenty of examples, it wasn't that far away from my family's origins in a way, from living on a small piece of land. But there is a problem that to be realistic about, is that the agendas as expressed will seek to stop some of these systems. They will seek to drive people off the land associated with various Agenda 21, 30, etc. And they will interfere with the freedom to do some of these things. So I know that there are some people, and I've had some good contacts with people that have formed communities, very enlightened communities, where they're trying themselves resilient. I think over centuries, through self-sufficiency and food production, in in places around the world and formed networks to that effect. And I think that's certainly a way to go. But we have to be aware that these may not be tolerated if we don't change the discourse. So we have to begin to support each other seeking to do those things. But we're so dependent, all these loops are coming together, and especially with the digital currency, as we know, that all these separate loops are going to come together in one big loop. And we can see that happening, for example, in the way that Trudeau reacted to the truckers in America. You know, and you say something the government doesn't want, and your you can be excommunicated digitally at a push button scenario. This is going to happen with this convergence of information and data about ourselves. So I see those things happening, and good luck, and it's great, but it's a mitigation, a marginal mitigation in many senses. We need to be think more radically, think more significant. I would have liked to see the development of local economies, but my concern is that it won't be allowed to happen. They will pass legislation. They will make it too complex. It is quite complex. Certainly when you're setting up alternative systems, alternative barter money systems, they don't like those things. They're going to. A lot of people believe that Bitcoin and those currencies will help. I'm not so sure. They integrate you into the technosphere, whatever way you look at it. They're increasingly going to be looking at the management of those and integrating those learning curves into national digital currencies. So there is, in some people's eyes, a model in Eastern Europe from the parallel society. The idea that you can set up a parallel society that the artists did in Czechoslovakia, in Prague and Poland. And there is something in that. And there's a broader idea. I hear people expressing that idea again on a broader scale, people that are opposing the COVID restrictions, that they can set up an alternative type of even government. Now, I'm afraid that's going to be a difficult one unless you're talking about a full-scale revolution, they did it in Ireland in the 20s, setting up their own court system, the Dáil court, etc. But they did so in the Republic, or what became the Republic, with a lot more popular support. You need a lot of public support to do these things, and that public support is not there yet. So I think we have to be very imaginative about creating networks which can't be captured with bright ideas about how we firstly resist the force of these networks that are making networks, of these loops of power that are imposing their rules on us, and begin to challenge them and begin to look at how they put agents of change into particular organizations. And actually, one of the most interesting studies that I've came across about how the New World Order operates, and a lot of people wouldn't think about look there, is by Malachi Martin, that priest exorcist who worked in the Vatican and then began to write fiction, or faction as he called it, explaining what happened, what was going on in the Vatican, how many people in the church didn't believe in anything supernatural. A lot of the main players didn't. He claims there was a satanic mass in the Vatican, for example. Interesting stuff. But he worked with Pope John Paul II, and he explains what was going on with John Paul from a diplomatic perspective, and his agreements with Gorbachev. Gorbachev, of course, was another New World Order person. He said that in a speech in 1988, around the time as George Bush talked about the New World Order that Joe Biden has reaffirmed recently. So it's not a conspiracy theory like people think, following on that idea of H.G. Wells. But he's very interested in explaining what was going on behind the scenes and how the Catholic Church fit in this. And he explains in one of his novels, Windswept House, about the kind of methods of the, if you want to call it the New World Order, about how they infiltrate, and how they infiltrate the church in this context, or organizations to achieve their objectives. So we have to become aware of what's happening. We have to look at the people like C.S. Lewis gave us a clue in his book, That Hideous Strength. That's an interesting artistic anticipation of the future. I think he was leaving a message for the future about the scientific organization called NICE, 4-letter acronym, and they were taking over. They were taking over the country effectively. They had taken over the universities, and he's writing about this in 1945. And they were associated with. They also had a connection with extraterrestrials and demonic entities, if you like, as well. It's quite a remarkable book. He called it a fairy tale for adults. I think he was telling us something, and he did refer in his writing to The World of Flesh and the Devil by Bernal. He was aware of what was going on, so he was seeking to advertise that in my view. And other people, if you look in the right places, some people in their art were telling us what's going on if we look at it and we cross-reference it. So we have to have some robust idea of how institutions are controlled first. Who makes the rules? The people that makes the rules are rulers. And rules, for example, international law is being displaced for an international based rule order. And that means whatever BlackRock and those other companies want it to be, or the Chinese Communist Party. It's abolishing law, in my view, because they don't want it. It doesn't suit their purposes. They can't have things like fundamental rights. So if we do anything, it's great when people are doing those initiatives, like you say, and it's great when people are trying to be self-sufficient and that. But we're all now in a globalizing order of regulation, and we have to begin to focus on certain methodologies or certain strategies or certain ideas that people individually on their own can begin to align in some sense to oppose it. So that's great, but if the problem is one of global magnitude, it'll be difficult over any long period of time for local initiatives to sustain itself against them, because they want a monoculture. They want standardization. They want the same thing everywhere. They want you to fit in with the computer, with the info structure, with the info ban. You have to become part of that, with the Internet of Things, to be assimilated into that. They don't want diversity. So we have to begin to fight for that genuine type of diversity, and begin to encourage and support companies, for example, that are imaginative strategies, but they're going to have to be quite bold in their imaginative attempts to solve some of these issues.
So what you were saying a moment ago about, getting a small holding, or, people bugging out or returning to the country. I mean, hardly anyone can do that. There isn't the scope for it. Not everyone would actually want to do that. They might want to be, to escape or sidestep what might be coming at them. But, we've been so used to, not living like that. And there's so many, cases of people, trying to go back to the land or whatever and failing miserably because they don't have the skills and just not understanding what it actually takes. So I don't think that's some kind of large scale, solution by any means. And, it's funny, in some of the most dystopian sci-fi that I read and watched when I was growing up during the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, it were these dark, dismal portrayals of what was essentially a dystopian, technocratic, in some cases transhumanist future. There was always some kind of positive note sounded, and maybe that's because, a lot of them were Hollywood films and that's just what they had to do. But for example, in George Lucas' first film, THX 1138, ultimately the protagonists find that there's a world outside, a much bigger, brighter, natural world beyond the narrow confines of the scientific dictatorship they've been living in, drugged up to the eyeballs and denied human contact. Love is the greatest crime, etc. In Logan's Run, again, the protagonists discover the same thing, a much bigger, brighter, natural world beyond this narrow, Scientocracy that they were living in. Even in the Terminator films and in the Matrix, there's this ultimate realization that they can smash this technology that's controlling them, that was portrayed to be everything, and that they couldn't live without. So there was always this idea of an underground or a resistance or some kind of guerrilla operation. And one thing that those tend to make clear, albeit they're being just stories, but as you know, we understand a lot of, you mentioned artists leaving clues for us. You know, a lot of science fact has come from science fiction. What films like those make clear that there can be no compromise with these, would-be technocratic overlords. There can be no rapprochement. You know, you cannot say, okay, we'll do half of what you want. How's that? Or we'll give a little bit, because it'll always take a little, you know, give them an inch and it'll take a mile, so to speak. So that's one message, I think, is that we can't, for those people who are saying, well, we'll just take, you know, however many % of this agenda and it'll be okay, or we'll just take the bits that we like, but not the bits we don't like. That's not going to work.
Yeah. Well, interesting on that focus on the word compromise. Again, I was looking at Malachi Martin, and I do find him interesting, and he probably wouldn't have been, his position wouldn't have been in the end much different from Ian Paisley's view of the Catholic Church. He believed it was taken over. So, I mean, he was serious about that, and he worked in the Vatican with John Paul and that. So, I mean, it's not hypothetical. He talked about the Jesuits. He is a Jesuit, and how they were taken over by materialism and the idea that there wasn't a supernatural, you know, for some of the key players, and you had to focus on the mortal and the mundane and what was here and now. And he finishes off the book by talking about complex. And so he's a theologian. He had a couple of PhDs, I think. He worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls, so he's a very serious scholar as well. And he said, well, what is the story about Judas? What did Judas do wrong? And it's a very interesting issue, because Judas, as you know well, has a very interesting figure for many artists, like Caravaggio, even U2. So he said, well, what did Judas do wrong? So it wasn't just, well, what was well, obviously he betrayed Christ, but why did he betray Christ? And he said that he betrayed Christ because he believed that he should be, you know, he was going to be powerful in a practical context, assume power in some way, and he was in charge of the kind of administration of the apostles, and this is his argument anyway. But he said that what Judas's sin is, the unforgivable sin, was that he made compromises. He wanted to make compromise with the Roman soldiers, with the empire. And he believed that there had to be some kind of compromise with the authorities. And it's an interesting way of putting it, because he was saying that the Judas complex is associated with making not some big dramatic thing, but it's about compromise. It's the same argument that C.S. Lewis said when that in the Inner Ring. He said, and he's addressing, I think, people that are graduating at, was either Durham or King's College London. And he said that 9 out of 10 of you will compromise. And so, I mean, that's quite a remarkable thing to say. He said you do it bit by bit. You'll do it with a friendly person who's kind of bringing you into the, you know, letting you in on the secret, who's smiling at you. You just got to know. And they tell you that, you know, there's this little thing that they do in the profession, and it's okay. Everyone does it. The public doesn't know. And he suggests that a lot of the great things that go wrong are from these little acquiescences. And I do think there's a lot. I do think some of these. Philip K. Dick is another one who was planting kind of. He was setting a Trojan horse for the future, because he had anticipated that artists in the future wouldn't be able to criticize the system that he was predicting that was coming. So I think he was trying to indicate some of the issues even then. And the other area that I've been looking at to try and interpret what's happening, especially in the context of automaticity, is that type of synth pop, and those people that explored the use of electronic equipment to establish new types of music and music that's your area and an area you're very familiar with. And I started off thinking about the Associates and Billy Mackenzie from Dundee, because I was listening to him talk, and it's very familiar to me. I was in Dundee at the time when he was still living. And if you look at a lot of the figures that were on the edge of the use of automatic equipment, electronic equipment, there's often something tragic about them. There's often some great beauty and some tragedy. There's a number of figures who either committed suicide or died in tragic circumstances that were associated, whether it be DJs or automatic music. And to some extent, I asked myself when I was looking at it, whether they were canaries in the coal mine, whether they essential, but also saw in a broader sense, quicker than other people did, that there was a dark scenario associated with our bound down before the machine. So as well as that, one key idea which has emerged from there is the loop. And if you go back and look, as you know well about Brian Eno and his type of music, and and again a lot of positive stuff, but there's some core ideas. If we take, for example, in rap music and the significance of the Amen break, the loop from 1969 that's used in the 7-second loop that's used again and again and again and again and again, the basis, which makes me say, all those songs, they're all the same, like my father used to say. But the loop is a very important idea, because it's used, for example, in propaganda, and it's used in computers. So you send out a signal that goes around and tests things until it gets what it wants to do. And this is the way the propaganda works as well. It keeps on going, it keeps on going, because it's set automatically. There is no, we are ruled now like a machine. If you go back to James Clerk Maxwell, 1868, his paper on governors about electromagnetism, I believe that they took they began to take these ideas about electromagnetism and begin to apply it to governance, which led to, for example, in 1948, the Ratio Club in America, the Macy Conference, and cybernetics. And Norbert Wiener goes back to that paper as a key idea in his concept. So it's the idea we can set up an automatic system, but the public is similar to something that we can put a current through. We can even put it through the different directions, go one way and then go the other way, to magnetize, to align the public opinion, for example. And so there is some hidden stories, I think, to look back, and some of those. There's another woman called Derbyshire who was a leader in electronic music in the United Kingdom. Last point, one of the origins, perhaps, of that is Bletchley Park, surprisingly. And we all know about the Enigma machine, but there's another interesting. After the Enigma code and that, they had to crack next. The big one was what the British called the Tunney cipher. Now, it's not anything related to my family. It was referring to the fish, the Tunney fish. So, funnily enough, the Tunney machine was one of the first programmable computers, because they had to. There's a guy called Tommy Flowers who Turing brought in, and he said you need transistors to break this code. And the code was a kind of teleprinter code which was communicated on radio waves. So it came through like music, and it was called new music. The people in Bletchley Park called it new music. And then they had to crack it, and they had to use transistors in that. And it's transistors which is the key issue in relation to transhumanism. And they're there already. They can put these things into the human brain. But the connection between these kind of, now in that context, the technology was used for good purpose, because that Tunney machine, which was the Tunney, which was the basis of why they used all the colossal machines, was to break down Hitler's communications. And it was very significant all through the latter part of the war to tell that he was withdrawing forces, or he didn't send more forces to the Normandy area, etc. So that helped in the D-Day landings. Of course, there's a dark side. In this case, Hitler, and there's the Lorenz machine, and there's a positive side. There's always good guys that come through. But we always leave it too late to get the good guys. I want some of the good guys to get their heads around these things before we have to use human ingenuity, these great individuals that came along to fight against tyranny. They use their ingenuity. Let's use it in a bit of a prophylactic way. Let those imaginative scientists begin to think ahead, to begin to think of countermanding, countermeasures to solve these problems, to stop these problems, to anticipate some of these problems. So there is a challenge there to the really clever thinkers, the ones that will sacrifice themselves. I'm not saying they have to sacrifice themselves, but I mean to go for the greater good, as is seen in plenty of these examples, and to learn the lessons from those artists that did have something to say, and that, in a way, in some of the synth pop, in a way, it sounds like a swan song in a way for the humanity if we don't get on top of these issues.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com